Snow drifted over Frost Ridge like the last breath of a dying winter god, and through that storm stumbled Officer Mark Reyes, 33, bleeding from a gunshot that tore through his shoulder, each step carving fear into the snow. He wasn't running from the cold. He was running from a weapons gang heading straight for his family. Just before he collapsed beneath the frozen pines, a former Navy SEAL and his K-9 appeared from the storm. And Mark whispered the words that turned a simple rescue into a race against fate. "Please, save my family before they get there." Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support these stories. May God bless you and protect your family tonight. Snow swallowed Frost Ridge beneath a roaring white veil, the kind that devoured sound, breath, and hope all at once. The wind screamed through the towering pines like a warning torn from the throat of the mountain itself. Ethan Hale stepped out onto the porch of his isolated cabin, his breath clouding the air, his sharp blue-gray eyes scanning the tree line with the instinct of a man who had lived too many years on the knife edge of danger. Ethan was 38, tall and muscular, with a rugged, weather-worn face carved by years in the Navy SEALs. A faint scar cut across his right cheek, a souvenir from a mission few were allowed to know existed. His short, dark hair was peppered with cold, and the coarse stubble on his jaw gave him the look of someone who lived closer to the wilderness than to civilization. He carried himself with the quiet weight of a man who had seen more violence than a lifetime should hold, but who now sought silence because peace was the only thing he hadn't been trained to fight. Shadow, his 4-year-old German shepherd, stood beside him, large, muscular, sable-coated, fur bristling under the cold wind. His amber eyes were sharp as blades, alert in a way that made Ethan straighten. Shadow wasn't barking at nothing. The dog's instincts were never wrong. Suddenly, Shadow launched forward, sprinting off the porch into the swirling white darkness. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed a flashlight and followed, boots sinking into the snow with every determined step. His breath hardened, not from exhaustion, but from something tightening in his chest. An old, familiar feeling he thought he had buried with his uniform. Trouble. Real trouble. The forest grew darker as he pushed deeper, the blizzard coating his coat and gloves with thick layers of ice. When he finally spotted Shadow standing rigid under a massive pine tree, Ethan hurried forward, then froze. A man was collapsed at the base of the trunk, half buried in snow. The navy blue police uniform was torn, the badge barely hanging from the shredded fabric. Blood, thick, dark, and terrifyingly fresh, had seeped across the man's left shoulder, staining the snow around him. Ethan dropped to his knees. The stranger looked about 33, with a strong athletic build, now trembling uncontrollably from cold and shock. His skin was pale beneath the frostbite creeping across his cheeks, and his dark brown hair was plastered to his forehead by melting snow. A thin mustache and rough stubble framed a jaw clenched in pain. His breathing came in shallow, ragged pulls that sounded like his lungs were fighting for every scrap of air. Ethan knew trauma, knew the smell, the weight, the trembling that came from a body too close to shutting down. And yet, despite his failing strength, the man's eyes snapped open when Ethan touched his wrist. Those eyes were warm brown, filled with terror, guilt, and something more primal, desperation. "Hey, stay with me," Ethan said, voice low and steady, the tone of a soldier who had pulled dying men out of worse hells. The man's lips quivered. He swallowed, coughed, then tried to speak. "Officer," he rasped. "Officer Mark Reyes, please." Ethan supported his head gently. "You're safe for now. What happened?" Mark Reyes tried to lift his right arm, but winced as pain tore through him. The gunshot wound had pierced high along the shoulder. Clean entry, dirty exit, bleeding badly. Ethan's stomach tightened. This wasn't a hunting accident. This was a tactical shot. Someone wanted him wounded, not dead, yet. "Please." Mark gasped again, snowflakes gathering on his eyelashes. My family, they'll find them first." His voice shook violently, not from the cold, but from fear deeper than any injury. His mind was racing faster than his pulse. Ethan could almost see the images flashing behind Mark's eyes. A wife, a child, faces he feared he'd never see again. The officer's breathing grew shallower. Instinctively, he reached for Ethan's hand, gripping it with surprising strength for a dying man. "You have to help them," he whispered, voice breaking with a mixture of terror and shame. Ethan hesitated, not because he didn't want to help, but because he recognized something hauntingly familiar, the look of a man who blamed himself for the fate of those he loved. Ethan had carried that same look years ago, when one wrong decision had cost a teammate his life. Mark's hand trembled. "Please, help." Then, as if the last thread of will had finally snapped, Officer Mark Reyes's eyes rolled back and his body went limp in Ethan's arms. The wind howled above them. Shadow stood close, ears pinned, watching Ethan for direction. Ethan stared at Mark's unconscious face, gripping the weight of his plea like a stone in his chest. He had spent years avoiding the world's chaos, choosing mountains over missions. But this was different. This was a man begging for his family's life with his final breath. As the snow continued to bury the wounded officer, Ethan understood something with a clarity he had not felt in years. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a race, and he was already behind. The storm had softened by the time Ethan Hale pushed through the cabin door with Officer Mark Reyes leaning heavily against him, but the cold still clung to both men like an unwelcome second skin. Inside, the crackling fireplace cast a warm amber glow across the log walls, illuminating the dust motes swirling through the air and the faint scratches Shadow had made on the wooden floor over the years. Ethan guided Mark toward the worn leather couch beside the hearth, lowering him carefully, aware from experience that too much jostling could tear the wound open further. Mark Reyes, now fully visible in the firelight, looked even worse than Ethan had feared. He was 33, broad-shouldered and fit, the kind of man who had built his life on physical readiness and duty. But now his uniform jacket was shredded, stained with both mud and blood, and his once steady hands trembled uncontrollably. His dark hair, usually trimmed short in the neat style of most officers, was now tangled and plastered to his forehead with sweat. His warm brown eyes, the eyes of someone who once believed deeply in protecting others, were clouded with terror and a guilt so heavy it seemed to bow his entire frame. Ethan cut away the ruined fabric around Mark's shoulder with steady hands. The wound was ugly, deep, raw, and still bleeding slowly despite the cold. As Ethan leaned in, the metallic scent of blood mixed with the faint trace of gunpowder. It told him everything. This wasn't a pistol wound. This was the type of round fired by military-grade weapons, the kind used by people who dealt in death professionally. Shadow, the 4-year-old German shepherd with a muscular sable coat, sat beside the couch, his posture rigid, ears pointed forward. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on Mark, studying him with the uncanny intuition that had made Shadow invaluable in Ethan's past life. Shadow wasn't barking, yet, but every line of his body warned Ethan that danger was approaching, not fading. Mark stirred, groaning, a low, painful sound. His eyelids fluttered open, and his breath came out in ragged bursts. Ethan placed a firm hand on his uninjured shoulder. "Easy," he said calmly, though his own pulse tightened with tension. "You're safe for now. Talk to me." For a moment, Mark seemed unable to focus. He blinked, as if trying to remember what safety felt like. Then the panic returned in a violent rush. He tried to sit upright, instinct of a man trained to react, to move, to take control. But agony tore through his shoulder. His face twisted, and he collapsed back onto the couch. Don't let them near my family," Mark whispered, voice trembling, as though each word scraped against something broken inside him. Ethan could see the man's internal battle clearly. Mark was not weak. His entire body bore the posture of someone who had spent years confronting danger, making split-second decisions, facing down criminals. But the fear in him now wasn't for himself. It was the kind of fear only a husband and father could feel. Fear that someone he loved more than his own life was in mortal danger. Ethan wrapped thick gauze around the wound, tightening it until Mark sucked in a sharp breath. "Who shot you?" Ethan asked, though he already suspected the answer. Mark swallowed hard, his lips pale. "A weapons trafficking ring. They call themselves Black Arrow." The name hit the air like a cold blade. Ethan paused mid-motion. Black Arrow. He knew the type, not from direct missions, but from after-action reports whispered quietly at briefing tables. A ruthless group, dealing in stolen rifles, modified handguns, armor-piercing rounds, and high-demand black market explosives. Men who would burn an entire family from the map to silence a threat. Mark continued, voice cracking. I caught them in the middle of a deal. Deep in the woods near the old quarry. I wasn't supposed to find them. I wasn't supposed to see. His breath hitched as another wave of pain struck. Ethan tightened the bandage to stem the bleeding. Mark clenched his jaw. I ran when they fired at me. I made it deeper into the forest, but they took my phone, my access codes, my home address. His voice broke completely. My wife, my little boy. They don't know what's coming. They don't know these men. They don't know what they do to families. Ethan looked into the man's eyes filled with remorse so deep it looked like a wound of its own. The kind of remorse Ethan recognized intimately. Years ago, Ethan had watched a teammate die on a mission he blamed himself for. That memory had driven him into these mountains, seeking silence. Now, staring at Mark, he felt that silence break apart like brittle ice. Mark's entire body trembled, not from cold, but from dread. Please, he whispered, don't let them die because of me. Ethan's jaw tightened. Shadow suddenly growled, low, deep, dangerous, his gaze snapping toward the door. Ethan followed the dog's line of sight, every instinct switching into combat readiness. Snow outside shifted. Something, or someone, was coming, and Mark's nightmare was already closer than either of them wanted to believe. Snow hammered the forest in relentless sheets, turning the world into a blur of shifting white and shadow as Ethan Hale pulled Officer Mark Reyes up from the couch, looping an extra heavy jacket over the injured man's shoulders. Mark's breath shuddered in his chest. Each inhale labored, yet his eyes, though clouded by pain, held a fierce determination sharpened by fear for the people waiting for him at home. Ethan could see the tremor in his jaw, the clenching of his teeth, the fight between physical agony and a father's desperation. Stay with me, Ethan muttered, tightening his hold under Mark's uninjured arm. The cabin door swung open, and the storm swallowed them, stinging their faces like shards of frozen glass. Shadow sprang ahead, the 4-year-old German shepherd moving with lethal precision, muscles rippling beneath his sable coat. His ears stood tall, body angled forward like an arrow loosed from a bowstring. He wasn't just leading, he was hunting. The forest roared around them, pines bending beneath the wind as if bowing before the violence sweeping through Frost Ridge. Ethan held Mark steady, guiding him over the uneven terrain, boots sinking deep into the snow. Mark's wound burned with every step, white-hot agony spiraling from his shoulder down into his ribs. His breath came out in choked bursts, vaporizing instantly, sweat mixed with snow on his forehead. He stumbled once, dropped to a knee, gripping the frozen ground. Ethan crouched beside him, eyes flashing with a soldier's urgency. Get up, Ethan ordered, not harshly, but with the tone of someone who knew failure meant death. You stop now, you die, and they'll go after your family next. The words stabbed through Mark harder than the bullet ever had. He forced himself upright, his face twisted with effort, his entire body quivering from pain. But he ran, not for himself, for the faces he saw in his mind. His wife's gentle smile, his little boy's laugh. He wasn't going to let those memories become gravestones. Behind them, the forest erupted with noise, engine revs, men shouting over the wind, the metallic crackle of radios slicing through the dark. Officer Reyes is alive. Fan out. He can't reach the house. The voices were distorted by the storm, but unmistakable. Mark's chest tightened. They weren't trying to kill him yet. They wanted to catch him before he reached help, before he warned his family. Ethan heard it too. His jaw flexed, muscles tightening as his instincts shifted into full combat readiness. They're closing in, Ethan said. We move faster. The trees thinned, opening into a narrow slope. At the bottom lay an old wooden bridge stretching across a frozen ravine. The beams were ancient, weather-beaten, sagging, the kind of structure the town had stopped maintaining years ago. Snow had swallowed most of it, turning the wood into pale bones jutting into the blizzard. Ethan glanced behind them, evaluating the distance between them and the voices closing in. His mind worked with the speed and precision of a seal. We're blowing the bridge, he said. Mark, teeth chattering, nodded weakly. He didn't know how the bridge would help, but he trusted Ethan now, the way a drowning man trusts a hand pulling him from the water. Shadow reached the bridge first, pausing only long enough to glance back, urging them forward. Ethan and Mark crossed quickly, the boards creaking ominously under their weight. Once they reached the opposite side, Ethan knelt, pulling a small pouch from his belt. Inside were compact explosive charges, military-grade, silent, deadly. The kind he had sworn never to use again. His hands stayed steady despite the wind. Years of muscle memory guided each placement. He secured the charges deep into the joints of the wooden supports, setting timers with fingers numb from frost. Then he rose and pulled Mark farther back, shielding him with his own body. The forest on the far side exploded with headlights, harsh beams cutting through swirling snow as trucks skidded to a halt. Figures emerged into the blizzard, armed men in tactical winter gear. Their silhouettes moved with purpose, spreading out with predatory hunger. Ethan pressed the detonator. The explosion wasn't loud, more of a deep crack that ruptured the night like the spine of a beast being snapped in half. The bridge shuddered, then collapsed in a violent cascade of splintering wood and roaring debris. Flames burst upward as the charges ignited, lighting the ravine with a hellish glow. Snowflakes turned orange, then red, then black in the smoke. For a brief moment, Ethan thought they'd gained precious time. Then he saw him. Victor Hale stood at the edge of the ruined bridge, framed by fire. The man was imposing, around 45, massive build, nearly 6.5 feet tall. His shaved head gleamed under the flames, and his thick neck and square jaw made him look carved from stone. His face was brutally angular, with deep lines etched around his mouth and eyes from years of violence. But it was his eyes that froze the air around him, cold steel gray, flat, and dead. The eyes of a man who felt nothing except calculation. Victor Hale, the leader of Black Arrow, a trafficker of weapons, a dealer of death, a ghost in the criminal world. He stepped closer to the fractured ledge, staring across the inferno at Ethan. When he spoke, his voice was deep, steady, and empty, like a judge announcing a sentence. "You're delaying the inevitable," Victor said. "His family is already on the list." The words slammed into Mark like a physical blow. His legs buckled, his breath punched out of him. And for the first time that night, true despair, not pain, not fear, but despair, flooded his face. He collapsed into the snow, body trembling, eyes wide with horror. Cold River Station emerged from the blizzard like the skeleton of a forgotten world. Its concrete walls cracked, its tall metal antenna bent under years of storms. Once, it had been a regional emergency response hub, bustling with medics, federal agents, and rescue teams. But now the building stood hollow and abandoned, windows shattered, doors hanging on rusted hinges, and snow pushing through every broken seam. The wind moaned through the empty corridors like a voice grieving something long dead. Ethan Hale guided Mark Reyes through the entrance, their boots crunching over shards of glass and ice. The pale glow from Ethan's flashlight slid across peeling walls and overturned equipment, revealing the ghosts of the building's past life. Mark leaned against Ethan for support, every step causing his wounded shoulder to convulse with jagged pain. His face was ash pale beneath streaks of dried blood, and frost clung to his hair. But behind the exhaustion in his warm brown eyes burned something new, an intensity, a resolve that fear had not completely crushed. Ethan led him into the central command room, where an old metal table and a bank of dead monitors remained. As he lowered Mark into a chair, Shadow trotted in and positioned himself at the doorway, his muscular frame rigid, ears pricked, eyes glowing amber in the dim light. The German shepherd's low growl hummed like a tension wire pulled tight. Mark swallowed hard, fighting the dizziness spreading through him. His chest rose and fell sharply as he forced the words out. "There's more. You need to know the whole picture." Ethan crouched beside him, checking the bandage. The wound hadn't reopened, but the skin around it was angry and swollen. Mark stared at the dark windows, as if seeing beyond them, back into the nightmare he had been running from. "Black Arrow doesn't just sell weapons," he said, voice trembling. "They supply extremist groups, mercenaries, foreign militias, people who can't buy guns through any normal channel. They're responsible for attacks around the world, and every time law enforcement blocks one of their shipments, they retaliate." He paused, grimacing as another wave of pain struck. Ethan placed a steady hand on his uninjured shoulder, grounding him. Mark continued, voice cracking with guilt. They keep a list of officers and agents who disrupted their trades. Some of those families disappeared. They don't just kill them, Ethan. Tears welled in his eyes, mixing with the snow melting on his eyelashes. They make an example. The words struck Ethan with a coldness the storm couldn't match. He had seen cruelty before, in war zones, in black operations, in interrogation rooms where human life meant nothing. But hearing it from a father, terrified for his family, twisted something inside him. Ethan had lived alone in these mountains for years, to escape the horrors that used to haunt his sleep, to escape the guilt that clung to him from missions where he couldn't save everyone. Now the past felt like it had returned, wearing a new face. Mark's. Mark suddenly grabbed Ethan's jacket with surprising strength. My wife, Ethan, my little boy, they're on that list. Ethan held his gaze, steady as an anchor in the storm. They're not dead, he said firmly, not while we're still breathing. Mark's grip loosened as exhaustion pulled at him, but hope flickered weakly in his expression. Ethan rose and crossed the room to the old equipment shelf, brushing off dust and ice from a long-disconnected emergency beacon. With practiced hands, he opened the panel, rewired the interface, and reattached the power conduit to his portable battery. When the device thumped to life and emitted a faint green glow, Mark's eyes widened. You can still reach the Bureau from here? Ethan nodded. Shortwave, limited range, but if the FBI has a mobile unit scanning frequencies, they'll hear us. He transmitted a coded distress signal, one only federal agencies would recognize. The device crackled once, then fell silent. Ethan didn't expect a response yet. He just needed them to be moving. He set the beacon down and turned back toward Mark. That was when they both heard it. Engines, dozens of them. The rumbling grew louder, vibrating through the cracked floor. Mark's breathing quickened. Ethan extinguished the lantern, plunging the station into darkness, except for the weak, red emergency light over the exit. They found us, Mark whispered. They were always going to, Ethan replied, but they don't know what's waiting for them inside. His voice was calm, but inside him something had shifted, a cold focus he hadn't felt since his SEAL days. He began moving around the interior with swift purpose, setting tripwires, placing makeshift traps using scrap metal and broken furniture, locking secondary doors, and cutting the main power to leave the entire building in absolute darkness. Mark gritted his teeth and forced himself upright. His legs shook, his shoulder throbbed violently, but he refused to be dead weight. He reached for Ethan's backup handgun, an older, heavy-duty sidearm, and checked the chamber with trembling fingers. The motion, though weak, carried a spark of defiance, a father refusing to let fear decide the fate of those he loved. In the shadows, Shadow stiffened. His fur bristled along his spine, a ridge of warning. His growl deepened into something dark and primal, the sound of a guardian sensing evil's arrival. Outside, tires ground to a stop. Doors slammed. Footsteps spread out around the perimeter. The storm held its breath. The battle for Cold River Station had begun. The darkness inside Cold River Station shattered under the violence of gunfire and screams. The moment the first wave of Black Arrow operatives pushed through the shattered entrance, Ethan Hale moved like a ghost awakened. Years of SEAL training surged back into his muscles. Precision, silence, lethal certainty. He became the blade the world had once shaped him to be. His footsteps were low and controlled across the dust-covered floor, his breathing steady even as bullets punched through the walls around him. The narrow hallways echoed with chaos, men shouting orders, boots pounding against concrete, the furious growl of Shadow tearing through the dark like a living storm. Shadow hit the first intruder with the unstoppable force of a missile, his powerful German Shepherd frame slamming into the man's chest. The attacker fell backward, screaming as Shadow's jaws locked around his forearm. Ethan didn't waste the moment. He delivered a swift strike to another man's throat, dropping him without a sound, then pivoted and fired 2 precise shots into the shadows behind him. Every movement was instinct, every action carved from years of surviving hell. Mark Reyes, bruised and bleeding, braced himself against a cracked pillar, raising the sidearm Ethan had given him. His hands shook from pain, but his eyes burned with a father's fury. Whenever he spotted movement closing in on Ethan, he fired, covering the man who refused to abandon him. The recoil sent sharp shocks through his wounded shoulder, but he forced himself to push through the agony. His family was out there, his wife, his little boy, and tonight he was fighting not for duty, but for love. Ethan swept down the hall, taking out 2 more gunmen with brutal efficiency. But the fight was far from over. A sudden crash echoed from the far end of the corridor, followed by heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, certain. Ethan knew before he saw him. Victor Hale, the leader of Black Arrow, moved like a man born for violence. His massive, broad-shouldered frame filled the hallway, the dull shine of his shaved head reflecting the flicker of emergency lights. His steel-gray eyes, devoid of warmth or emotion, locked onto Mark Reyes with a predator's focus. Victor seized Mark before Ethan could reach him, one massive hand clamping around the officer's throat as he dragged him upright. Mark choked, his boots scraping against the floor as Victor shoved a pistol hard against his temple. "Your family dies tonight," Victor growled, his voice low and cold, the promise of a man who had ended countless lives without a flicker of remorse. Mark's breath hitched. Terror flared inside him, raw, primal, suffocating. But beneath it burned a father's refusal to accept that fate. His lips trembled, his eyes pleading, not for himself, but for the people waiting at home. Ethan didn't allow Victor a second attempt. Training surged through his body, calm in the storm, breath slowing, sights aligning. He exhaled once. A single shot exploded from Ethan's weapon. Time froze. Victor's eyes widened in pure surprise. Not fear, because a man like him didn't know fear, only disbelief that someone had beaten him. Then the light left his eyes. He collapsed, hitting the floor with the heavy finality of a felled beast. The pistol slipped from his lifeless fingers. Mark dropped to his knees the moment Victor's hold vanished, gasping, shaking, the adrenaline finally breaking his composure. Ethan rushed to him, helping him stay upright as Shadow trotted toward them, ears forward, tail low, blood from the battle staining his fur. Before Ethan could say a word, the distant wail of federal sirens cut through the storm. The reinforcements he had signaled for were finally arriving. FBI tactical units poured into the station, their heavy boots stomping through the rubble, weapons raised as they moved room to room. A senior agent approached Ethan, breathless, frost clinging to his tactical vest. "We intercepted Black Arrow's second strike team," he reported. "They were heading for Reyes's home. They never made it." The words struck Mark like a physical blow. This time not of fear, but of overwhelming relief. His lips parted, and for a moment no sound came. Then his eyes filled with tears, falling hot against the freezing air. "Thank God," he whispered, voice breaking. "Thank God. Thank God." His legs gave out, and he collapsed into the snow outside the station, laughing and crying at the same time, every emotion he had held hostage finally escaping. The storm had begun to fade, giving way to the first fragile rays of dawn. Frost Ridge lay coated in soft gold, the rising sun turning the snow into a glowing field of quiet grace. Shadow gently pressed his head against Mark's leg, the weight warm, steady, comforting. A reminder that he wasn't alone, that he had been worth saving, that his family was safe. Ethan stepped out into the pale morning light, looking upward. The sky was opening, the dark finally giving way to brightness. And in the stillness, he understood something deeper than duty or fate. Sometimes, God sent broken, desperate souls into the paths of others, at the right moment, in the right storm, so they could be saved, protected, redeemed. And sometimes, the ones offering salvation were the ones who needed it just as much. When the sun finally rose over Frost Ridge, it didn't just bring light. It brought a reminder, one carved into the snow, the silence, and the breath of every soul who survived the night. Because sometimes, God doesn't move mountains in front of us. Sometimes he sends the right people into the storm with us. A former SEAL who had lost his way, a wounded officer fighting for the ones he loved, a loyal dog who never questioned who deserved saving. And somehow, in the coldest hours, grace found them all. In our own lives, we face storms too. Fear, loneliness, burdens no one else sees. And yet, just like Mark and Ethan, we are never as alone as we think. God places people on our path at the exact moment we need them. And sometimes he makes us that person for someone else. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it. Leave a comment about where you're watching from, and subscribe so more souls can hear stories of courage, faith, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your home, and walk beside you through every storm you face. Because sometimes the greatest miracles begin in the coldest nights.